Welcome to WCG Talks Trials, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of clinical research, sharing the latest trends, insights, and best practices from experts across the industry. In each episode of WCG Talks Trials, we'll explore a different area of the clinical trial industry, while featuring a diverse range of clinical research and medical professionals. If you're passionate about advancing clinical research, improving patient outcomes, and driving healthcare forward, then WCG Talks Trials is the right podcast for you. We are so glad you could join us today.
Hey everyone, I'm Silvio Galea, Chief Data and Analytics Officer at WCG. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleague, Melissa Hutchens, Vice President of Research and Benchmarking for today's WCG Talks Trials podcast with a focus on AI and clinical trials. We're going to be discussing how generative AI, amongst other types of AIs, are being used, the benefits, the barriers, some concerns, and who else knows what'll come up. Before we dive in, let me remind you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on all your favorite listening platforms, whether it's Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and others, so you never miss an episode of WCG Talks Trials. So thank you for all our listeners who are tuning in. And before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and then turn it over to you, Melissa, to introduce yourself. Silvio, I've been with WCG for about 2 years now. I've got a background in data, AI, analytics, digital transformation with a career spanning medical startup devices, payer, health tech, automotive, and a bunch of other technologies. And it's just pretty exciting to be in the clinical trial space. With the state that AI is in, it's really a great time for the technology to be helping with the clinical trial process. So looking forward to discussing a little bit of that today. And would like to hand it over to you for a bit of an introduction, Melissa.
Thank you, Silvio. I'm happy to be here to discuss this very important topic. So I am Melissa Hutchens, VP of Research and Benchmarking. I lead the benchmarking data analytics team at WCG, and that includes the umbrella of the KMR Group forums and solutions. I also moderate the Pharmaceutical Benchmarking Forum. And yes, agree, AI is such a very important topic, so happy to dig in.
Excellent. So I guess we should start with talking a little bit about AI. Right, and what it is. And it's nothing new. It's been around for decades, but it's really in the past few years that we've seen a transformation where it's gone from being something behind the scenes to something that most of us, if not everyone, is using in one way, shape, or form. Namely, this is due to large language models, right? These little chatbots that generate essays you could have conversations around. And it's a type of technology that's really surpassed adoption of any other technology that's been introduced, whether it's been mobile tech, internet, and other consumer techs. You know, what to remember about Gen AI is that it's a subset of many different types of artificial technologies, right? We've got machine learning, natural language processing, expert systems, vision, speech, planning, robotics, others, and large language models or generative AI, aka large language models, are that type which work with large sets of language. And, you know, I was thinking about how to explain what a large language model is at its core, that, you know, large language model auto completes a word. So if you're something like a happy H, it might say happy holidays. But if the context is a bar, it would, you know, predict happy hour. So it's all about how it's, you know, been trained on language. And, you know, we hear about things like hallucination. The hallucination is in effect the incorrect completion of a statement given the context and the question. So you'd be hard pressed to attend any conference today that deals with clinical data management, clinical trials, or clinical development without hearing about AI. Every conference we've been to in the past few years has been very heavy with AI, especially with generative AI. But speaking specifically in the space of clinical trials, where do you see it having a role today, Melissa?
Yeah, Silvia, well, I think we absolutely expect AI to help increase, you know, the quality of clinical trials, to reduce cycle times, and of course also reduce costs. And yes, we've absolutely seen some increased efficiencies in these processes for sure. But AI does require significant investment, and we should continue to, you know, systematically measure that return on investment, because with every added AI technology comes not only that cost burden of the investment, but also training that technology, implementation of it, validation. And then there's a critical element of trust in the technology. So all of these steps, I think, are critical and take time to really create a robust process to really be able to see those increased efficiencies.
Yeah, that's true. And it comes with a need for an investment on the technical side as well. This is a technology which doesn't come free. The infrastructure, the data infrastructure, the platforms have to be in place to be able to provide the processing, the rules, the quality, the oversight, etc. So there is a lot of work that has to be done in the background. Don't know if we'll get into much of that today. Really want to focus on how it's applied in the clinical trial space. So maybe if we start off with a broad perspective, there's many different facets of clinical trials: planning, startup, conducting the trial, analyzing the data, closing it out. But there's also the work that happens beforehand in the drug development space. So from a broad perspective, how do you see generative AI and or machine learning techniques being used in drug development?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I would say in drug discovery, we've seen the use of these deep learning models that can be applied really to the first two stages of discovery. So you can think of those stages as target identification, validation, also then leading to compound screening and generation of leads that we will eventually want to get into the clinical trial space. So once when you're in this space, they're looking for ways to be able to predict that the stability of the molecule, the toxicity of the molecule, and really establishing models to even predict what side effects a molecule could have. This has a really high potential of identifying more successful candidates that we can bring to development and save time by eliminating some of the manual processes that we've seen of the human trial and error and experimentation and interpretation along the way. I think if we kind of move to the broader development level, once you're in the clinic at the high level of R&D, we're looking really at probabilities of success. So what's the likelihood that a molecule will transition from one phase to the next, for example, given its mechanism of action, given its characteristics? I think the broad reality is that we're heading towards more personalized medicine in general. And AI has really high potential here to help identify these connections into specific patient populations, subsets of groups when we're conducting clinical trials, and making treatment really more successful, specifically by analyzing these population subsets.
Right. So it's definitely something that's being used for drug design, synthesis, screenings, identification. A few months ago, I was talking with somebody about drug repurposing, right? And how existing drugs can be used for other treatments.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also, with drug repurposing, with AI, you can now even look at the data of drugs that are on the market and what's happening once on the market, and really creating real world evidence to improve, future development of drugs, given that data that we now could have access to of drugs that are on the market and how the population is responding.
Yeah. That phase of research definitely benefits greatly through AI. I think it was the Association of Cancer Centers that talked about a 2x increase in drug discovery with AI assistance versus traditional methods. And I think that's due to a lot of the manual processes you mentioned before, which end up speeding up the process. Pretty exciting time. So when we look at AI in the context of a trial, once we complete the first phase of research for new drugs and therapeutics, how do you see it being used? Where in the process do you see benefits?
Yeah, within clinical trials, there are, several processes that I think we can talk about here. We have, the protocol design, study startup, the recruitment stage, conduct of the study, as well as analysis and preparing for regulatory submission. So we talk a bit about the design of the study. I think this is a key area where using these types of machine learning models can help you predict trial outcomes, which in turn allows you to design the study for an optimized conduct. And this can include adjustments, earlier in the process. So for example, you could be optimizing the dose or the dosing schedule using AI modeling, reduce some of that trial and error that we had before. You could even start to predict what types of patients may drop out of a study and create some strategies to prevent those dropouts. And I think we spoke a little bit about already predicting what patient populations would be more likely to respond to the drug. But on the flip side, you could also predict which are more susceptible to an adverse event. All of this really allows sponsors to hone in on this idea of prevention versus reaction. Throughout all of this, we also want to be conscious of the burden on the patient. But we all know that, enrolling trials is very difficult. So any improvement that we can make on that patient burden would be key. So things like minimizing visits that the patients have to do and procedures that they have to undergo, will all help recruitment as well.
Yeah, there's also the flip side of that, which is on the site burden front, right? As a sponsor, if your trial is quote unquote very burdensome for a site, it might lead the site to overlook your particular trial, select others. And so I think that, speaking of patient burden and site burden, they're kind of like two sides of the same coin, and to make sure that we can see this through efficiently as well as recruit and retain patients through the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, once we have that kind of optimized design in place to reduce those types of burdens, you move into the space of really getting the study up and running, right? So then here we've seen AI models help with selection of countries and selection of sites. So companies have to sort through all of their options, right? You have the options of sites that have experience. You also want to incorporate their performance ranks. And these are all areas where AI and more specifically, these machine learning models and can create outputs that help you predict that probability that the site's going to actually enroll patients for your trial. And even including now the space of specific patient demographics. So I think AI here, creating certain types of models that provide indices for, prospective site enrollment can really help companies select the best sites for the studies, which in turn will create higher quality and optimization in their trial.
Right. So there's the site identification, which sites, which countries would be most optimally aligned, both experientially and from a regulatory perspective for the particular conditions of a particular trial, as well as the feasibility, right? What's the likelihood of the sites, countries, and combinations, PIs, et cetera, being able to see this through most successfully?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that brings us then to how well you can actually recruit for that trial. And this is where we're seeing more automated, patient trial matching using AI. So the use of large data sets like EHRs, EMRs, claims data, demographic data, even imaging data, simplifying the search for that patient. So you're essentially able to pinpoint a more specific patient pool that's already passed some basic criteria that you have without actually doing any physical screening or phone screening. You're using data to identify those patients. And then on the flip side, I think AI is also helping create trial awareness. So, I know we were at a recent conference where we heard that, a woman was giving a keynote and just talked about her diagnosis with MS and how the prescription that her physician gave her at the time of her diagnosis essentially would exclude her from key clinical trials that were ongoing. There's just really not a good connection between that diagnosis point and trials that, are active that could potentially help that patient as well. So I think AI can have a big impact in that particular space too.
Certainly. Yeah. Yeah. Being able to identify individuals, making information available to them, all the while protecting privacy, security, and anonymity is something that the technology can help with. You spoke of patient identification using EHRs, and, there's a number of big cluster EHRs out there, and individuals' data might be split amongst them. So having access to just one or two might not give you everything you need for a particular individual's full medical record over their time. So I do think that there's something to be cognizant of there, making sure that when we look at an EHR, we're not necessarily getting the full picture on the individual level.
Yeah. And I think that also speaks to, there's so many disparate data sources, right, that are out there. And that's one of the key challenges that we talk about when creating these models is what is the right data? How many data sources do we need? And I think your point is spot on that, there's no one place where all this data resides. So companies are working very hard to gather as many of the right data sources as possible. And that's a real challenge.
Yeah, and that comes back to what we were talking about a little bit before with infrastructure modernization and advancement. There's new technologies, there's legacy architectures that won't go away in various companies. Data is growing fast. It's moving faster. And, I think we have a challenge, right? Because the more data we have, the more risk of fragmentation and siloed data, which leads to more cumbersome point-to-point connectivity. We have limited interoperability specifications, right? Every time we do a data integration, half the time it's like, here's my spec, here's your spec. Let's figure out which one it is. And we don't have a common spec that we all adhere to. And so all those things combined really create a barrier for an advancement in internal analytics and AI, just because we have such a backload of data to overcome. Not to say it's something that should slow us down, but something that we need to plan for.
Yeah. And I think you're seeing that too, when you talk about this, just vast amounts of data that we now have access to. I mean, even within a clinical trial, that's becoming true as well. Right now, you can capture so many more data points than you did before. We could essentially be drowning in data from a clinical trial. You've got the ability to track subjects with these wearable devices that are going to create, thousands of data points now that now you have to sift through. I mean, the benefit of that is, of course, allowing us to see some early safety signals, efficacy signals, because you have access to all of that data real time. So I think that is helping the outcome of the study to be able to get those early safety and efficacy signals. But there is a lot more data now. There's the data points collected have exponentially increased. So dealing with all of that information is also, I think, one of the challenges that companies are facing.
With the advent of all this data, AI can also be used to help us handle this load of data, whether it's clustering it, qualifying it, verifying it, providing quality checks on it. So it's not just the analyst or the individual who's getting all this data presented to them, but there's an AI which augments and assists them in the appropriate data processing. Thinking back of a couple of examples on this, one thing that comes to mind is during I think it was the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine trial, where by using a data integration layer where data was brought to center, so to say, versus it being distributed in a handoff workflow, there was a reduction of time from last patient visit to database lock, which typically takes about 30 days. I think this was done to about 24 hours. So if we could get ahead of the data streams, there are demonstrations of how these modern systems can vastly improve efficiency and speed compared to prior processes.
Yeah. And just taking that, I think you're absolutely right. I think just reducing that time to database lock and then kind of further to the clinical trial report, Gen AI is helping generate these documents in a more efficient way, like using prior documents and being able to compile all of this data into the, tables that are needed for that clinical trial report, et cetera. I think that's also an area where we're seeing a lot of benefit and time savings and creation.
Yeah. We do need to make sure that those technologies have the appropriate guardrails. We could do that through putting in place the appropriate context. So in the example that you mentioned for document generation, starting with a set of documents that would be used as templates or reference points. So for example, in the ICH R3 that was recently released, we in the industry all have a ton of SOPs and other documents that have to be adherent to that. They need to be updated to be in line with the latest guidelines. Great opportunity for generative AI to be given the latest guidelines, be given the documents at a sentence by sentence or paragraph by paragraph level with the appropriate guardrails to then show what, if any, updates need to be made to bring that document in line with the latest guidelines. Obviously, always want to have a human in the loop there, but that type of example certainly helps with the time that we would otherwise put in to make these updates.
Absolutely. And I think, we're obviously not there yet with some of the recent amounts of errors that we see when AI does generate this type of documentation. The error rate is still on the higher end. You could still see a 20%, 30% error rate or omission of key points that need to be in the documents. think we're definitely moving in the right direction. But as you said, I think that human element is not going to go away, at least not anytime in the near future.
Right. Yeah, there is a balance with the error rate and knowing that there's going to be outliers that have to be addressed by the individual overseeing the technology, and important to never let the technology out on its own, especially at this point of time yet. It's not there yet.
Yeah. And there's, in order to be able to efficiently use these systems in AI, there has to be trust in them, right? And if we're seeing error rates still, there's still that lack of trust. And that comes not in just the document generation that we've been talking about, but even when you're talking about these more complex machine learning models, those models are extremely hard to explain because they're just so complex. These neural network models are very complex. So it's not the same as our traditional, linear regression models we had in the past. So really being able to understand them, to be able to interpret them, but then to be able to have trust in them. That is, I think, something that we're still trying to assess and to get to the point where they can be more fluidly utilized. I think that human element, again, is such an important part at the moment. And all of us really learning more about the modeling and how to interpret it and how to use it is key.
Yeah, trust is certainly a big issue. And that comes with making sure that the technology is used for the appropriate use cases, and that there's the necessary level of transparency for the understanding of what's happening, along with the appropriate guardrails for the validation of the processes.
Yeah, I think one area where we've seen, just immense progress too has been within imaging. I mean, we know that, AI has a really high potential to identify differences in images that are able to help us diagnose and also measure the progression of disease. I think the challenge here is, we're building these databases and we're training that AI. But I think in areas like mammography, for example, you can compare the previous images against each other and you can detect breast cancer at a much earlier point than you could before because those changes are escaping, the human eye. But the AI is able to really hone in and target those changes. So I think that's huge advancements in that space when it comes to imaging, and especially in oncology too, you have tumor progression and modeling of tumor progression. I read a story recently about a dad who was following his daughter's cancer and her tumor progression using an AI that he created and generated, and would really reference that AI and submit the images from her scans to really have the AI model out with how that tumor would progress. And the AI was really spot on with that progression, not the outcome that they desired. But it just goes to show that you can use those types of technologies to predict how the disease will progress.
Right. Yeah, indeed. I mean, along with TB, X-ray scans, computers and those algorithms are consistent in the work that they do, regardless of it being on the 8th hour of the day or after lunch. The output given a consistent input will be consistent, and it certainly can provide early screening at a broader and much lower cost than is done today to help us in conditions that can be identified through imaging earlier and faster.
Yeah, and that's really, really exciting. I think a really exciting space for the use of this technology. Yeah, so we've covered a lot of ground today. I think, about most importance, I think it's really talking about the safety of the patient throughout all of this. I think that's really the number one priority, as putting any of these processes in could put a patient in jeopardy. So we have to have a very regulated adaptation, especially when it comes to things like creating potential dosing schedules or relying on AI to predict the toxicity of a drug. So these can be really very dangerous things to get wrong. And we touched on also, a lot of the data source and quality issues, opportunity for bias, the validation and interpretation of these models, and lack of trust. There's just a lot of, we've made a lot of headway, but there's still a lot of work to be done in order to really, streamline this process and bring AI into more of our day-to-day operations throughout clinical development.
Right. Yeah. I mean, above it all, we always need to ensure patient safety with whatever we do. Ensuring data quality, consistent data source accessibility, You mentioned the interpretation, but I do think that there's also a certain amount of education for the users to understand accuracy, what's happening under the scenes, and that although sometimes AI might sound authoritative, there always has to be that second opinion to verify, depending on the type of AI we're using, what the outcome is, especially when blindly relying on things like generative AI. I think some of the other AI techniques have a lot more validation built in. And from a generative AI perspective, we need to make sure it's used in places where it's not creating the answers, but helping us generate the answers that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think in general, it's a new toy, right? Everybody wants to use AI. Everybody wants to see what it can do. But we always have to start with looking at the business and saying, okay, where can AI help us? What processes can we improve so that we're not, all over the place with the usage? I think looking at the business closely and what problems need solutions and how can we apply AI?
Indeed. What's the outlook, do you think, given the advancements? Where do you see us going?
I mean, I think, as we said in the beginning, I think the idea is to improve quality, reduce timelines, reduce cost. And I think as, all of the different areas we've talked about here today, have played some part in achieving one of those or all three of those things. But I think we come back to the challenges that we're facing with the data sources, quality, structuring all of that, creating trust and interpretation, et cetera. I think that all of those things are going to need to continue to evolve for us to be able to efficiently apply all of these new AI and machine learning models to the space.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I definitely agree. Understanding where it helps in a business process perspective, ensuring that it's offered as an assistant and not a replacement, and putting in place the appropriate guardrails of both the usage and underlying data are the foundations for an effective AI deployment. I feel like I've asked a lot of the questions. Anything that, turning the mic over to you, any questions you have or anything that we didn't cover today?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. This has been really great. Thank you, Silvio, for having this conversation.
All right. Then, before we wrap, I wanted to thank you, Melissa, for joining us today and sharing your insights on this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Also, thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And if you have any questions or want to get more information about this or other topics, please feel free to visit WCGclinical.com. We hope you found this episode insightful and that you'll join us for future episodes. Thanks again. Talk to you all soon.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of WCG Talks Trials. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred listening platform as we continue to explore different areas of the clinical research industry. As always, we encourage you to join in the conversation. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear on the show by visiting us at wcgclinical.com/podcast. We're here to serve as a trusted resource as we work to improve lives and accelerate clinical research together.